In Jonestown, Pennsylvania, life played out like a subdued melody. A tranquil composition of small-town virtues, daily errands, and quiet dreams. It was a place where grand dramas were confined to paperback novels in the local library and impassioned love stories to old films on TV. But like any seemingly simple tune, there were complex harmonies and counterpoints in the lives of its residents that belied the surface calm. Loren Reynolds walked through the hallways of Jonestown High School with an aura that defied the setting. His dark brown hair tumbled carelessly, often obscuring his striking green eyes. It seemed as if nature itself conspired to give him an air of mystery. His teacher saw him as a beacon of well-rounded achievement. An athlete and diligent student rolled into one. Among his peers, he was a social riddle, belonging everywhere, but nowhere, his charm making him equally enviable and admirable. Then there was Rowan Townsend, an enigma in her own right. Her dark brown hair framed a face both beautiful and contemplative, a living portrait touched by the gentle brush of curiosity. Daughter of the owners of Townsend's grocery, Rowan existed in a world of receipts and routine, but her brown eyes were windows to an internal landscape rich with wandering thoughts and secret wishes. And at the heart of her secret wishes was a name she inscribed in hidden corners of her notebooks: Loren Reynolds. High school life for them was a balancing act on the precipice of adulthood. Words unspoken accumulated in the air whenever Loren and Rowan were in the same space, their eyes occasionally meeting but quickly parting. Mark Townsend, Rowan's older brother and Loren's best friend, served as both a connector and a divider, his presence filling spaces that silence otherwise might have claimed. Homecoming was that quintessential high school milestone where teenage dreams and realities collide. That fateful evening, Mark drove, the car's interior charged with the residual adrenaline from their victory. He was young, immortal in his own eyes, and his driving reflected that exhilaration. The night was dark but electric, full of youthful invincibility, until a bend in the road betrayed them. Tires screeched like a discordant violin. The world outside the car window became a blur of motion, color, and then darkness fell, swallowing everything. In that suspended moment between life and death, Mark's eyes met Loren's. A wordless communication of surprise, regret, and finality passed between them just before the world tipped over into chaos. Out of the wreckage and the enveloping gloom, she materialized. Ethereal and unsettling, her presence was a paradox, beautiful yet frightening. Her eyes, like congealed blood, bore into Loren as she leaned over him and whispered in a voice hauntingly serene, "Do you want to live?" Trapped in a twilight between agony and shock, Loren managed a nod. What followed was a moment of cruel intimacy as her fangs extended elegantly and pierced his flesh. Each droplet of Loren's blood that she drank felt like an irrevocable moment stolen, a slice of his humanity surrendered for eternity. As Loren felt the icy tendrils of his new existence creep through him, she glanced dismissively at Mark, who lay unmoving as if she had just leafed through a less than engaging novel and found it wanting. With that, she disappeared, a wisp of malevolent beauty, leaving Loren to an existence of unimaginable complexity. Loren awoke hours later, Mark's unblinking eyes a silent indictment in the morning light. Sun rays seared his skin, introducing him to the first of many betrayals he would suffer in his newly changed state. With a heavy heart and a body that felt like a betrayal, Loren staggered away into the enveloping shade of the nearby woods, carrying with him a terrible secret that would mark him forevermore. In one harrowing night, Loren Reynolds had become an unsolvable puzzle, eternally altered. He was left with a life that held endless nights, yet paradoxically, no future in the world he once knew so intimately. He lay concealed in the sunken ground, his body shuddering as the sun's rays seared his newly sensitive flesh. Despite the heat, his heightened senses, still swirling in disarray, caught the sorrow-laden wail of oncoming sirens, like the lamenting cries of banshees foretelling doom. He tried to rise, but his body, caught in the alchemical process of a dark metamorphosis, rebelled against him. Emergency lights painted the scene with glaring urgency as paramedics arrived. They maneuvered through the wreckage, their faces etched with the seriousness of those who frequently encounter mortality. First, they found Mark frozen in a lifeless tableau. Then they discovered him. His figure crumpled in the ditch, his flesh tinged a sun-scalded red, but still, impossibly, alive. Intrigued and baffled by his sunburn-like symptoms, they lifted him onto a stretcher. Inside the hospital, The sterile room felt like an incubator for his newly forming nightmares. The bed bore witness to a grotesque miracle. Wounds sealing shut, flesh recogniting in a macabre of accelerated healing. Yet as these supernatural abilities manifested, he felt his human essence erode, leaving him straddling the realms of mortality and myth, belonging to neither yet imprisoned by both. Fearful of being discovered, a specimen under a microscope, he had to get out. On the third night, shrouded by the comforting darkness he now called home, he detached the medical tubes and monitors. Clad in pilfered hospital attire, he vanished, leaving behind an unsolvable enigma wrapped in empty sheets. Returning home, he rifled through his closet and pulled out his suit. It hung on him like a facsimile of his past life. Despite his bone-deep exhaustion, the respite of sleep eluded him. His new condition robbed him even of that simple human refuge. Days later, he was but a specter on the periphery of Mark's funeral, clad in the incongruous suit. There, amidst the sea of mourners, he found Rowan, still a vision though now veiled in grief. When their eyes met, a silent tapestry of unvoiced feelings wove itself between them. For a heartbeat, she seemed to waver, lips parting as though she might break her silence, break the distance. He offered no words, no sanctuary. He simply pivoted and withdrew, blending with the graying gravestones, leaving Rowan rooted to the spot, her hands either clenched in impotent anger or racked with confusion. As he disappeared into the woodland's embrace, the weight of his new, shadowed existence bore down on him. Now a creature of the dusk, he was severed from the diurnal world he once knew, in a labyrinth of morally perilous choices. Each corridor leading to another damned state, he found himself irredeemably astray. From Rowan's perspective, life had unraveled into a series of fragmented moments, each one tinged with an undercurrent of loss and disbelief. Mark was gone, and with him vanished a stable pillar of her existence. His emotional landscape was a barren field, interrupted only by the stinging nettles of grief, and in the center of that wasteland was Loren, the enigma, the absentee, the hollow where a heart used to be. Day after day, Rowan found herself standing in front of Loren's house, her knuckles sore from knocking on a door that never opened. She'd leave notes, texts, and voice messages, casting them into the abyss like prayers to an indifferent God. Each unanswered call was a mirror to her own spiraling despair. Then one night, propelled by a blend of exasperation and a desperate kind of hope, she found him. He was standing in a field under the moonlight, looking more like a piece of the night than a living, breathing human. His dark brown hair lay unkempt, his green eyes held an indescribable distance, and his skin, always touched with the blush of vitality, now appeared almost translucent. "Is this how you mourn?" She finally broke the silence, her voice as brittle as autumn leaves, staring at the moon as if it holds the answers to life's tragedies. Uninvited, she reached out to touch his hand. It was cold, far colder than any living flesh should be. He glanced at her, seemingly about to speak, then seemed to think better of it. "Don't blame the weather, Loren," she snapped, feeling an anguish she hadn't known she possessed. "You've been emotionally frozen since that night. Mark was your best friend. He was my brother, and you vanish as if you owe us nothing." Her voice was a tumultuous river, carving its path through the canyons of her grief and confusion. She awaited his reply, an explanation, an argument, a plea. Anything. He looked at her, his eyes twin pools of unfathomable sorrow and secrets. "Leave," was all he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet as irrevocable as an epitaph. Then, with a fluidity that seemed to mock the very laws of nature, he vanished into the night, leaving her to grapple with a new, gnawing emptiness. Rowan would continue to search for him, of course. She would look in all the old places, tracing and retracing the footsteps of their shared history. But Loren was gone, as irrevocably as the setting moon, leaving her alone in a world suddenly too large, too full of unanswerable questions. And so, she would find herself once more knocking on doors that wouldn't open, staring into nights that held no answers, lost in a labyrinth of eternal twilight, haunted by the absence of someone who had become something unfathomable. A modern-day myth in a world no longer capable of believing in the mythical. Her love had become a ghost story, a parable whispered on the edges of reality. Loren, who had once filled her world, was now an ungraspable phantom, a legend vanishing into the misty realm of folklore and eternal night. And Rowan, the abandoned seeker, would continue her quest, forever haunted by an absence as tangible and chilling as the cold touch of a hand that was no longer human. As the days turned into weeks, Rowan found herself submerged in a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight, pushing her further into the depths of an ocean of despair. At night, she would lie in bed, her eyes stubbornly open, as if sleep was a betrayal of her vigil for Loren, for Mark, for the life she thought she had. Yet inevitably exhaustion would win, and she would drift into sleep to the accompaniment of her own muffled sobs. Her daytime existence became a haze of obligatory motions, eating without tasting, talking without connecting, living without feeling. Her family watched her, their concern growing with each day that saw her spirit dim a little more. Finally, one evening, unable to hold back the tide any longer, she broke down in front of her mother, Sandra, and her sister, Natalie. They were sitting in the living room, a space filled with mementos of a happier time, a reality that now seemed as remote as childhood fairy tales. "I can't go on like this," Rowan finally said, her voice choked with tears. "It's like I'm drowning and I don't know how to swim back to the surface." Her mother reached out, holding her in a tight, maternal embrace that made Rowan feel like a small child lost in a storm. "I miss Mark so much," Sandra murmured, "but I can't lose you too, Rowan. You have to talk to someone, find some way to navigate through this grief." It was then that Natalie, usually so reserved, so measured in her emotions, spoke up. "Is it just Mark you're mourning, or is it also Loren?" The name struck her like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Seeing her reaction, Natalie pressed on. "We've all seen it, Rowan. How you and Loren looked at each other when you thought no one was watching. It's always been there, that palpable tension, that unspoken thing between you two. We never understood why you never acted on it, never crossed that line from friendship into something more." Rowan looked up, her eyes meeting Natalie's. In that moment, she realized that the secret she thought she had so cleverly hidden was, in fact, an open book to those who knew her best. It was a relief and a burden all at once, knowing that her love for Loren was acknowledged, even as it twisted the knife of his absence. "I don't know," Rowan finally admitted, her voice a fragile thing. "I always thought there'd be time, time to figure it out, to finally say what we both wanted to say. But now he's gone, vanished like a wisp of smoke. And Mark is really gone. And I don't know how to live in a world where both of them are just absent." Her voice broke on the last word, dissolving into a torrent of tears. Natalie and Sandra held her, their own tears mingling with hers. It was a tableau of shared sorrow, a moment that crystallized the profound dislocation they all felt. In losing Mark and, in a different way, Loren, they had lost essential parts of their world, leaving them unmoored in a reality that felt increasingly surreal and incomprehensible. The gravity of her depression, now openly acknowledged, became the fulcrum around which Rowan's family organized their lives. Sandra began researching therapists, even as Natalie took on the role of Rowan's unofficial emotional guardian, checking in on her, offering her own brand of tough love and tenderness. Yet even as they circled around her, a protective phalanx against the world's cruelties, Rowan knew that the journey back from the edge of her emotional abyss was one she would have to undertake alone. It was a grueling process marked by more failures than successes. Some days, the mere act of getting out of bed felt like a victory. On others, even the simplest tasks, a load of laundry, a trip to the grocery store, felt like insurmountable obstacles. Yet each day she tried, driven by a mix of stubbornness and a burgeoning awareness that life, in all its messy, painful complexity, was still a gift. But even as she began to take the first, faltering steps towards healing, a part of her remained trapped in the labyrinth of her past, a shadow realm where Loren's absence loomed like an ever-present specter. It was a love story with no resolution, a narrative cut off before its natural denouement. And so, even as she strove to live in the present, Rowan remained haunted by the ghosts of what could have been. A spectral love, an unanswered question that would forever echo in the corridors of her heart. Deep in the woods, far from the life he once knew, Loren was a lost being, wrestling with his new, terrifying abilities. The forest became his testing ground, a place to come to grips with the thirst that gnawed at him from within. While he had fed on animals to stave off the urge, the relief was temporary, a thin veil over a hunger that only grew more insatiable. Then, he found it an old lumber mill, set apart from civilization, adjacent to a well-maintained mansion. It was remote enough to keep attention away from his former home. Under the cloak of night, he invaded the mansion, effortlessly overcoming any obstacle. The family inside became nothing more than a means to an end. Lives extinguished in a matter of moments as he took each one of them in their sleep and drained them of all of their blood. He felt the warm blood coursing through his veins and his body becoming stronger. As he took in the aftermath, the weight of what he had done settled in. What had once been a sanctuary of warmth was now a mausoleum, a monument to his terrible actions. In that moment, he felt as if he'd lost yet another fragment of his remaining humanity, devoured by the beast he was becoming. It was then that he heard them, whispers swirling around him like a chilling breeze. The shadow emerged on the walls, formless and haunting. The woman who had cursed him to this existence seemed to be mocking him, driving him further into madness. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the void, his voice a blade of suppressed anger and bewilderment. "Why have you done this?" Just as suddenly the whispers ceased. The shadow vanished. He was alone again, more adrift than before. A new emotion surged through him. Not sorrow, not regret, but an overpowering, uncontrolled rage. It was a loathing not just for the enigmatic woman who had made him, but for himself and this unnatural life he now led. The emotional turmoil left him questioning. Was it this incessant internal struggle that truly defined his monstrosity? His thoughts offered no resolution. His creator remained elusive, and his own identity was even more slippery, now more than ever. He was a creature lost in darkness, haunted not just by her shadows, but by the growing shadow of his own soul. So each passing night, Loren sank deeper into his new existence, a realm of endless dark, haunted by specters, the ghost of his victims, the elusive figure of his maker, and most troublingly, the shadow of his own crumbling humanity. Loren found himself pacing restlessly in the confines of the abandoned lumber mill, now transformed into his lair of sorts, a hiding place from the world and a prison for his tormented conscience. His eyes, altered and sharp, scanned the intricately carved walls, built years ago by hands that had never known such darkness. How much of him was still human? Each night seemed like a battle between what he used to be and the creature he was morphing into. He experimented with his powers cautiously, stretching the limits of his speed, strength, and heightened senses. It was exhilarating, but each new discovery was a harsh reminder of the cost, the erosion of his humanity. He was aware that even the most restrained use of these abilities chipped away at the moral scaffolding that had once defined him. His thoughts were frequently interrupted by sharp, clawing hunger. The thirst for blood was a constant undercurrent, a relentless whisper urging him to act against his remaining principles. Each time he fed, the line between Loren the man and Loren the monster blurred a little more, and he found himself rationalizing the grim necessities of his new life. Though he managed to avoid taking another human life after the family at the mansion, he couldn't escape the haunting feeling that it was only a matter of time. Each drop of animal blood he consumed seemed to stoke the craving for something more, something infinitely more satisfying yet morally abhorrent. As he stood contemplating, he suddenly felt a deep, chilling loneliness engulf him. Memories of Rowan flooded his mind, her face a beacon of what he had lost, of what he could never have. Even if she did love him as he suspected, he could never subject her to the dark path he now walked. It was in this moment, weighed down by the despair of what he had become and what he had left behind, that he understood he was at a crossroads. One where he relinquished whatever tethers to humanity he still held, fully embracing the monstrous nature he was cursed with. The other, a treacherous climb towards some semblance of morality, an uphill battle against his own predatory instincts. Yet even as these thoughts swirled in his mind, Loren was vividly aware that time was against him. With each rising moon, the call of the night grew stronger, tempting him to surrender to the pull of eternal darkness. And as he stood there, in that dilapidated mill surrounded by the hushed whispers of the forest, he knew one thing: he had to make a choice, and soon. And there, enveloped in a silence as deep as the night, Loren felt a strange pause, A breathless, still moment as if the universe itself was waiting, holding its breath for the choice he was yet to make. Frozen in that moment of existential indecision, Loren's senses tingled, as if picking up a distant melody only he could hear. His eyes flickered toward the moonlight streaming through the gaps in the worn lumber, casting eerie patterns on the floor that seemed to dance and shimmer like apparitions. Could it be that even the celestial bodies were mocking his tormented duality? Just then he thought he heard something. A voice, a whisper as soft as silk and as cold as the night. He whipped around, half expecting to see someone, but he was met only with empty space and echoing silence. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just another trick his heightened senses were playing on him. Or perhaps it was the onset of a deeper form of madness, the price he had to pay for the supernatural gifts that were more like a curse. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps snapped him back to reality. Someone was approaching the mill. Panic surged through him. He was not ready to be found, not like this. With a swiftness that defied human capability, he hid himself in the darkest corner of the mill, eyes trained on the entrance, waiting. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped in. It was a man seemingly in his late 40s with an air of authority yet weighed down by some unseen burden. This was no ordinary passerby. Loren could sense it. Intrigued but wary, he remained hidden, watching as the man looked around almost nostalgically, as if recalling days long gone. Finally, the man spoke, albeit to himself. "They said you were a legend, a myth, but here you are. Here it all started, and here it all ends." Zoran's eyes narrowed. The man was talking as if he knew something perhaps even Loren himself wasn't fully aware of. Was he another like him? A creature of the night, or perhaps something else altogether? After what seemed like an eternity, the man sighed, turned around, and began to walk away. Loren was flooded with both relief and frustration. Who was this man, and what did he want? As the man reached the threshold, he paused and said, almost as if speaking directly to Loren's hidden presence, "You can't hide forever. The choices you make, you have to live with them, or die with them. The time to choose is now." The door closed behind them with a deafening finality, leaving Loren alone once more in its dark sanctuary. It was as if the universe had sent a messenger to hasten his decision. The enigmatic man's words resonated with the crisis raging within him. As the night wore on, Loren found himself pacing again, each step a moment stretching towards an inevitable resolution. The man's visit had shattered his solitary confinement, injecting it with a pressing sense of urgency. The choice was no longer a vague inevitability. It was immediate, compelling, and laden with consequences he could scarcely begin to fathom. It was as though he'd reached the end of the first act of a play, an unsettling interlude before the curtain would rise again to either tragedy or triumph. With a heavy heart and an uncertain future, Loren took a deep, unnecessary breath, the irony not lost on him. He was, after all, a creature that didn't require air, but was suffocating under the weight of his own existence. And there, in the silent depths of his newfound darkness, Loren knew he was at a turning point, one that would lead him to salvation or damnation. And so, the night held its breath once more, waiting for Loren to exhale.